Coming up, what does Manchester City's legal victory over the Premier League mean? And now Jannik Sinner's been banned, why is tennis so divided?
Plus, what can the world of sport learn from the £1 billion auction over the 100 English cricket's answer to the Indian Premier League?
And it wouldn't be a Sport Unlocked podcast without some FIFA and Club World Cup news.
So much to unpick on this week's episode of Sport Unlocked with a special guest, Elizabeth Ammon from The Times, with everything to know about the finances of franchise cricket. Later, she'll be joining Martyn Ziegler from The Times, Tariq Panja from The New York Times, and myself, Rob Harris from Sky News. And we've been all around this week.
You've been to Madrid, Tariq's in Kenya again still, and I've been all the way to the West End of London.
Glamorous world of a Premier League meeting. But the Premier League waited till the clubs weren't in the room the next day to land the big announcement on Friday. This was the outcome of the arbitration tribunal, the case brought by Manchester City against the Premier League over the sponsorship rules relating to profit and sustainability regulations, these focusing on associated party transactions. We had the first findings in October, found that parts of these regulations were unlawful. They then changed the rules very quickly in November at a Premier League meeting to respond to that ruling. But now here's another arbitration panel finding that actually between 2021 and 2024, till they were changed, the Premier League rules on sponsorship were void and unenforceable. A victory this is being seen as for Manchester City. These relating to the rules that limit how much clubs can earn from commercial deals, ensuring that such sponsorships are at a fair market value if they are clinched with companies relating to the ownership. And these are rules that were brought in after the Saudi takeover of Newcastle in 2021, very quickly brought in, and of course had an impact on Abu Dhabi-funded Manchester City as well. Certainly this is being celebrated at Manchester City, but the Premier League says that this has no impact on the valid operation of the new rules. And those new rules relate to the previous findings, so clubs now have access earlier to a data bank which shows them how much sponsorships should generally be worth on the open market, and also ensuring that shareholder loans are also considered at fair market value, so there aren't favourable rates, all as clubs try to limit those losses to £105 million over 3 years. So, while the Premier League says that this tribunal made no findings about the validity and effectiveness of the new rules, to complicate matters, Manchester City have another arbitration case against the Premier League over those new rules as well. It is complicated, and maybe we won't know the ultimate winner for a bit still.
It's incredible that this situation has blown up. I'm not surprised at all by this latest panel ruling. I think when it made its judgment in October that certain clauses were unlawful, then that meant that all the rules at the time were void. I can understand that. It seems like common sense to me. What I think is more tricky is having amended the rules, which they're now going to look at again, is whether the amended rules are okay. Common sense to me says that they should be because they've been amended, but I guess the key question is whether those amendments were in themselves okay, and if they weren't, then we're sort of back to square one. So this is a really testing time for the Premier League, for sure.
It sets people out there opining one way or the other on what this means. But again, until it's actually concrete and crystal clear, we don't know. And that's the thing. It's the Premier League seems to be in the grip of this, almost feels like a battle to the death with Manchester City, its serial champion. It's such a weird thing for something like this to happen. Serial champions of your league, the team that has been in the last decade, its star performer in this kind of battle, which looks like a battle to the death. This is one of Britain's best, if not, it's Britain's best known export. What a weird thing to happen to it. And, with these two parties seemingly with their knives pointed at each other, it's just pretty grim really as well, isn't it?
The other obvious legal thing that we're waiting for, which could happen in the coming weeks, is the outcome of the charges, the 115/130 alleged rule breaches by Manchester City. That is going to come, you would expect, within the next month or so. And I think although the cases aren't related, I think as we've said before, it does seem this is all part of a battle between Manchester City and the Premier League, and perhaps they're making clear that whatever happens, another legal fight is going to potentially be on our hands.
So, Tariq, you missed us at the Premier League meeting as we were finding out the latest on the profit and sustainability rules. Those are the rules that's led to points deductions in recent times for Everton, for Nottingham Forest. We had expected they would be abandoned by the Premier League, but they're staying in place next season.
Yeah. I think it's actually became quite a predictable outcome when you think about it, because the Premier League's facing not just one, but two legal challenges. One is Manchester City against associated party transactions, and the other is from the Professional Footballers Association, the Players' Union, around the new financial rules which had been proposed to replace it. One of those is the squad cost ratio. It's already used by UEFA. UEFA's rule is going to say you can only spend 70% of your revenue on wages, transfers, agents. The Premier League was going to bring that in with an 85% limit, but I think the clubs basically accepted that it's pointless doing that until you know what's going to happen with these associated party rules, which govern how much an associated company can give to a club. So, for example, the most famous one, I guess, is Manchester City and Etihad, because Etihad is owned by the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Sheikh Mansour is part of the Abu Dhabi royal family, vice president of the UAE. So it is an associated party. Should there be limits? The rules say that there should be limits on how much they can give. There has to be fair market value. Manchester City is challenging that. So unless we know, or unless the clubs know what the rules state, it's probably pointless having the new financial system. So PSR rules here to stay. For some clubs, Rob, that's going to be tricky.
It will be if they'd been anticipating no longer having to abide by those rules. But yeah, again, caught up in the midst of legal challenges.
This really has been a cumbersome process and a very bitter one in terms of getting to the rules. Regular listeners will probably hear us talking about, I've been hearing us talking about this for weeks, months, if not years on end, about the Premier League's rules and financial fair play and creating an equitable field for all teams to be successful. We said last week the performances of Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth show that perhaps the rules do work. This idea that teams are closing the gap, or it might just be this season, time will tell. But the other thing that's interesting, it's the clubs that are making these rules. The Premier League is a collection of the clubs. It requires a 2/3 majority for any new rules to come in. And look, hopefully this delay in getting to the final rules will maybe mean that we'll get a set of decent rules that are well drafted and they're not going to be challenged at every turn once they come in. But the thing with these challenges, I think that's now part of the game now. This shadow competition off the field in terms of challenging the rules for whichever team feels aggrieved. It's a case of who's got the best legal defence as well as the best defence on paper, and who's got the best legal attack as well as the best forwards.
I've seen City's actions described as a legal onslaught against the Premier League, obviously defending their position as they have been in that bigger 130 charges case we wait the outcome of. Another big legal story that has been breaking, the conclusion of the Jannik Sinner case, and he does seem to be the clear winner against the World Anti-Doping Agency, the world number one managing to accept a 3-month ban over 2 positive doping tests last March. So the Italian won't miss any slams, doesn't lose any titles, and he's back by the French Open in May. Wilder had been seeking a 1-year ban, challenging the ruling by the International Tennis Integrity Agency not to suspend Sinner at all. They don't insist they were right because the breach is still, in this latest ruling, being found to be unintentional.
The original story related to a massage that Sinner received from his fitness trainer. It said that the physiotherapist Giacomo Naldi had been using an over-the-counter medication that had clostebol, an anabolic steroid in it, to treat a cut on his finger. And as he regularly massaged Sinner some of that may have got into the tennis player's body, and that's how he tested positive. There's also initial anger, of course, that this was all kept under wraps, kept secret until it all been decided initially.
I have some sympathy with what the British former number one, Tim Henman, said about this, which is that it all seems a little bit too convenient. The Australian Open's out of the way, and then suddenly this deal's agreed, which sees him able to come back for the French Open.
It has been pretty divisive. Just look at some of the online reaction. Stan Wawrinka saying, "I don't believe in clean sport anymore." Nick Kyrgios commenting, "Fairness in tennis does not exist." He's called it a sad day for tennis. And Daniel Medvedev said that, "I hope everyone can discuss with WADA and defend themselves like Jannik Sinner from now on."
There's a lot of anger, isn't there? There is players, current and former, who say there's a two-tiered system and have pointed out that this ban essentially allows Sinner to return just before Roland Garros and the French Open, meaning, in terms of any meaningful punishment for failing a drugs test here, it's not that bad, is it? Because he's performed at the Australian Open and he comes back just in time for Paris. Now, is that an agreement that works out for all parties and a type of justice that isn't available to all athletes? And this idea that because he's who he is, one of the best men's players, if not the best men's player currently active in the game, he gets special treatment. And again, speaks to the anti-doping system and perhaps how it might appear or appears to be opaque in some senses. And that's not a good look for Sinner, for tennis. And here, in particular for WADA, again, where some of its own rules and some of its own kind of structures seem to be open to question here. It just reminds me again about the Chinese doping case that we wrote about last year, with the 23 Chinese swimmers being cleared in secret and no one knowing anything about it.
Professional Tennis Players Association bemoaning a lack of consistency. But Sinner's lawyer says that he gained no competitive advantage. Regrettably, errors made by members of his team led to this situation. Since all of it, Sinner's won a third Grand Slam at the Australian Open in January, and his ban ends just in time for his home Italian Open in Rome at the start of May.
Doping is obviously it's not a black and white issue sometimes, and clearly they're saying this was a contamination, and that the clostebol that was found in his sample was unintentionally consumed. But that is the argument that a lot of sports people use. But it's been a very busy week for legal sporting matters, hasn't it?
In London, Sam Kerr, the Chelsea and Australia striker, has been found not guilty of racially aggravated harassment of a police officer who she called stupid and white. Kerr was standing trial following an incident at a police station, which she'd been driven to by a taxi driver who'd been in dispute with. This was following a night out drinking, and Kerr had felt trapped in the back of the taxi. Then at the police station, Kerr believed that the police officer was using his power and privilege, feeling the officer was dismissing her concerns. But Kerr has been cleared. She did say in a statement she apologised for expressing herself poorly on what she called a traumatic evening, insisting, though, she did not intend to insult or harm anyone. There is another football-linked trial that is ongoing. This was in Spain, and I was in Madrid for a big moment in the Luis Rubiales trial. That was the former Spanish Federation president testifying, defending himself over the World Cup final kiss on the star player Jenny Hermoso, insisting that it was consensual and not sexual assault. That is disputing the evidence of Hermoso. This incident on that podium after the victory over England in Sydney, and he is standing trial alongside three co-defendants from the Spanish Federation previously. Huge interest out there.
Can journalists get into the court, or was there limited space, or most of the crews outside? How does it work?
Well, the trial is being televised, so you can watch the feed from inside the courtroom, and translations being provided by channels like our own. And outside, though, there are lots of crews all waiting to get around Luis Rubiales. It was a scrum I wasn't quite expecting. In England, you wouldn't be asking questions as someone was leaving such a criminal trial in this way, but this is just being heard by a single judge, and we're waiting now the verdict from the case. It's a case still resonating very widely in Spain. It's about more than the kiss, about the coercion, about whether there was an attempt to force Hermoso into defending Rubiales in the hours and days after that World Cup final. Your mind goes back to that period in August of 2023. He stood up at the Spanish FA Emergency Assembly with the full expectation he was going to resign, but then suddenly, defiantly staying on, critical of those condemning him, and even giving the coach Jorge Vilda, who's also on trial for alleged coercion, a new contract. Within weeks, of course, we saw the toppling of Rubiales forced out, as well as a UEFA vice president. And I didn't actually hear if he said it, but it was a scrum outside court to observe rather than, I think, to be asking questions in that moment.
A reminder of that Herednap trial outside the doors of Southwark Crown Court. I remember correctly when he was found not guilty in I think it was a money laundering case. The scrum of journalists around him is a little bit like in the Rubiales case, but of course that was afterwards. Perhaps the difference in this case that there are no contempt of court rules in the way they exist in the UK on public reporting, because there's no jury who could be influenced by the media coverage here. So that might be why it's different there.
Also creating a lot of discussion in Spain was an incident in a women's league match at the weekend where the Barcelona player Mapi was accused of touching around the crotch area Espanyol's Daniela Caracas. Barcelona insisting that their player did nothing wrong, while Leon was being accused of violating her rival's privacy.
Yeah, and not just that, also I think alleged to have made a very sort of unpleasant remark as well. So I'm not surprised it's caused such headlines in Spain, because it's a potentially troubling case.
Only she would know if there was any intent in her actions there. But what struck me was, again, the depressing abuse directed on social media towards the victim. It's just one of these things that you know is going to happen. It's inevitable. The social media climate, if anything, is getting worse with the rollback of any of the guardrails that were there before. So, in this case, again, we've seen it, and we're going to see it again, sadly, in the next weekend of football.
And we've seen this with Manchester City's Jamaica player Khadija Bunny Shaw, who's been subject to racist and misogynistic abuse online after a recent defeat. She then stepped aside for the next game to protect her mental well-being. All this amid statements from football authorities of condemnation, but little sign of them putting pressure on the tech bosses running these social networks. Maybe they're just too focused on the business side of football. This in a year of the newly expanded Club World Cup, and that contentious tournament was brought up at the Premier League meeting.
Manchester City made yet another sort of plea for the to be allowed to have a delayed start to next season because of their involvement in the Club World Cup. But I'm afraid it fell on deaf ears again. So, they're going to have to face the fact they're going to have a sort of reduced break period for their players. But I suppose they'll think the price is worth paying if they can get lots of money from participating in the Club World Cup in the USA.
They could previously point to the fact that clubs go on pre-season tours all around the world, but that they are after you've had a summer break. This time, you'd have had the Club World Cup straight off the back of a long season, both with club and international games. Then they'll have a break, but then you actually need to get back up to fitness again. So you need to play some matches to warm up again. But will they be having a very short break, having to play friendlies, be match fit, or will they be going straight into the season? There is a physical challenge to this, maybe one not completely considered by those organising the Club World Cup.
Yeah, you're right. Those pre-season tours are as much to kind of get players into shape. You can't just go straight into a season. I just don't. I think that's just you're at a disadvantage.
The thing with the injuries and the calendar and the timetable and the crunch, I think you have to look at FIFA in pushing this through at a time where they haven't got everyone around the table to deal with the global football calendar. you're seeing hamstrings pinging all over the place with more matches in European competitions, for example, and now with the Club World Cup coming up as well. You would have thought they would have got the calendar sorted out before pushing through this tournament.
So I think there's a genuine issue around. It's not just player burnout; it's becoming more susceptible to injury. Manchester City losing Rodri, the World Player of the Year in terms of the Ballon d'Or, losing him to a serious injury. Arsenal have lost several players in the last couple of months. So, it's something that the authorities need to, I think, pay more attention to.
And in terms of Manchester City trying to catch a break from the other Premier League clubs, you don't think they will now, because for a lot of them they're seen as bad actors given the behaviour with all of the legal challenges and the rest, which is their right. But when it comes to asking the Premier League to do something like delay the season, you can imagine a bunch of their rivals thinking, heck no, why are we going to help them out? And that's why it shouldn't be down for the Premier League to decide when things start. It should be FIFA's role as the game's governing body to actually give a decision or rules set out in terms of how much break football players are going to get, because we're going to see more injuries, just like Rodri's. It's inevitable.
Rodri was at the Super Bowl in New Orleans, as was Gianni Infantino with the FIFA delegation, and they're promoting the Club World Cup while there as well.
Yeah, well, I've been surprised if Johnny wasn't there, wasn't it? I think. But
with Donald Trump as well.
Yeah, of course. First ever, as we said, sitting US president to go, bizarrely.
Surprising, there was some criticism of him leaving the match early, but it did take others to point out he actually helped fans by doing so, because it meant some of those security restrictions were eased and it allowed them to leave the dome much easier afterwards.
Yeah, I think it wasn't as though the result was in much doubt. It wasn't a cliffhanger, was it? I think it was well and truly over by that time, so perhaps he can be forgiven.
Interestingly, obviously the Kansas City Chiefs were seeking a third consecutive Super Bowl victory, but they lost to the Philadelphia Eagles. They missed out on a three-peat. Do you want to know something interesting about the term three-peat?
Well, I hadn't heard of it until last week, so tell me. Yeah, when I saw it, I thought, that sounds like a horrible pun.
It was a term trademarked by the LA Lakers head coach in the 1980s when his team was on for a third title in a row in the NBA. But then they went and missed out on that three-peat, maybe jinxing it, but he owns the trademark to it.
It's all business when it comes to sport in America. And for Gianni Infantino, he really does need to think about business with this Club World Cup, because interest so far appears to be dire, judging by the fact that the ticket prices have collapsed. So hopefully him trying to promote this tournament will make some sort of difference.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get any national team needing to pay for that trademark, really, for winning 3 World Cups in a row. It seems quite a challenging feat for that to ever happen. We mentioned Club World Cup, FIFA, they've been using semi-automated offside. That decision at the Premier League meeting, I can't believe we're still discussing it, because it's been in place in so many different other competitions, being able to automate the offside now. But it's been so slow coming into the Premier League, but it's finally getting closer.
Yeah. More than 2 years ago, I think FIFA had it, the Qatar World Cup. So, yes, I think the Premier League part of the reason for the delays, they went with a different company, different provider. I think the idea, they thought it was going to be better, but they have had problems with the testing, which has led to the delay. But it's going to get into the FA Cup 5th round, and then only if successful will it come into the Premier League.
Well, that's the key decisions in the Premier League meeting. Well, in France, the only reason we ever seem to discuss French football is the financial turmoil or struggles. And here we go again.
Yeah. So DAZN, the British streaming platform we sort of seem to be talking about more than any other broadcaster over the last 3 months, is facing an issue over the fact that they not paid the money to the French league that they're supposed to pay in February. And so we've had this situation now where the French league have said that they've referred the matter to a judge in order to obtain an order against DAZN to pay the amount that they need to pay. So we know that they've made huge losses, billions of dollars over the last 5 years, several $1 billion, but they have agreed to pay FIFA billion for the Club World Cup rights, which some people would say was well over the odds. So it's strange indeed.
Some people will say that £1 billion or $1 billion is high, Ziggs. Not some people. I think everyone beyond DAZN and FIFA who they signed that contract with, because, the market that they went out to bulked at half of that amount, judging by what we've heard. We still haven't found a good rationale for why DAZN has paid that $1 billion. And of course, we pretty sure there's going to be this investment of about the same money from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, who are partners with FIFA with the 2034 World Cup, which was arrived at in somewhat cloudy circumstances, perhaps more Saudi money coming into FIFA by way of sponsorship. It's a really, interesting little group of connections there. But DAZN itself is nuts, isn't it? I mean, they lost north of $6 billion in the last 5 years, owned by the billionaire Len Blavatnik, chap who was born in Ukraine, raised in Moscow, is a Knight of the Realm in the United Kingdom, and also has a passport in the United States. He would be someone I'd love to talk to, just to explain, what the heck is going on. What was the business rationale for what he's done with DAZN? Because he couldn't never have imagined that Saudi Arabia is going to be there to bail him out at the end of this when he started, what looks, at least on paper, to be a folly.
And it wouldn't be a French football discussion without mentioning Nasser al-Khelaifi, the Paris Saint-Germain president. And so often down the years, he's been linked to various investigations and prosecutors looking into his conduct and always defending himself. He has been mired in various legal difficulties over the years. Here he is again.
Yeah, this is a very complicated case. The way things happened in France, the investigations are formally opened, and that's what has happened here. The 51-year-old PSD president and head of the QSI, Qatar Sports Investments, he's basically on an investigation around a investigation into vote buying and interference with a case involving a French businessman called Arnaud Lajadere. He denies any wrongdoing. It's all quite complicated, and speaking to people close to him say, well, I think there's a confusion over the Qatar Investment Authority, who had Lajadere's group was a subsidiary, and then Qatar Sports Investments, which Nasser al-Khelaifi is the head of. So I'm sure this will tick over for months to come, as it often does in France, and whether anything comes as an outcome, we wait to see.
The details of whether Nasser al-Khelaifi is involved in this or not involved is obviously important in terms of this case, but it does again put this man, who seems to be at the centre of everything with involving Qatar and sport, squarely at the centre, again, in headlines that I'm sure the Qataris don't like. Qatar, corruption, legal cases, that they surely will be sick of it. And he seems to be, a lightning rod for it, partly or almost exclusively because he is the front man for that country. We've talked about before the number of hats he wears. He's obviously the chairman of beIN Media Group, one of the largest, if not the largest, buyer of European sports rights, football rights in the world, president of Paris Saint-Germain, the European Club Association, and he is a minister without portfolio for the Qatari government. And he is perhaps the most well-known Qatari in the world, and I'd include the Emir of Qatar in that because he's kind of their front guy for the world's most popular sport. I reckon most people recognise him before they recognise the Emir of Qatar.
Nasser al-Khelaifi apparently telling investigators last week that he's in the middle of a case in which I have absolutely no connection whatsoever, all on the basis of a single telephone communication concerning a problem with Qatar, a question I had to pass on, and my role was limited to that. And yes, he's defending himself yet again in this, and he believes he's been spuriously implicated. One unsettling FIFA story that has emerged over the last week, it's of the arrest of a FIFA employee, Jack Coles, near the governing body's offices in Miami. And this is an arrest by Homeland Security agents. He's accused of having sex with an underage boy, a 14-year-old he's alleged to have met on a dating app while on a work trip from Zurich, where FIFA HQ is. And there was an apparent attempt to meet him again last week.
Yeah, but it turns out when he went to this meeting, according to reports in American newspapers, actually it was he was accosted by a group of investigators from the police. The FIFA have suspended him. I think it's a case which clearly is going to be quite concerning from them. He wasn't a particularly senior official. I understand he was involved with the sort of sound production at FIFA events, but nevertheless, this is somebody sort of coming from the Zurich headquarters, going to the Miami offices, so will be troubling.
Coles, who is 39, had given interviews. There's quite a long YouTube video online talking about his role at FIFA and how he's achieved it. So certainly prominence in that regard, as he was involved in organising the music for various major events at FIFA. The Miami Herald said that while Coles did not know the boy was 14, the team did tell him he was 16 years old when they chatted before their first encounter. That's according to the complaint, and there are various screenshots of messages that form part of this investigation. FIFA saying that they're aware of ongoing legal proceedings in Miami. The alleged offences are serious and of a personal matter with no link to his work at FIFA. The individual has been suspended with immediate effect and until further notice. The biggest sports business story of the week was in cricket, and we touched on it last week, but it's the auction of the 100 franchises in England. Now, perhaps a lot of our audience isn't fully familiar with the world of cricket as we look all around the world. So many, particularly listening in Italy, we're high up in the Apple chart there at the moment. But to help guide us through the whole process, what the 100 means, what a complicated world of different cricket formats as well, is the Times journalist Elizabeth Ammon, who I was with at Lord's for the announcement. Welcome to Sport Unlocked.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So the England Wales Cricket Board has valued the 8 franchises in the 100 at £975 million. You've covered cricket for many years. How big a moment do you think this is?
I mean, it's huge in terms of English cricket. It is the biggest moment in a generation, maybe longer. It's more money than the English game has ever experienced. I mean, this is sums of money that beyond English cricket's wildest dreams, really. But it's also a sort of significant shift in terms of this is the first time that private investment is coming into the game, other than what was touched on at the briefing, Rob, with the Alan Stamford, who is now in jail for the rest of his life, trying to buy English cricket.
That was a memorable moment in 2008. He landed at Lord's on a helicopter, brought a treasure chest of cash. It turned out to be fake cash, later exposed as a fraudster and jailed. And that was the great hope at the time. He was promising 2020 matches that'd be worth millions.
He was. He promised a lot, delivered none of it. I think that, it's interesting because that actually, people felt very burnt by that. So I think English cricket has tried to stay away from private investment and from sort of, men carrying cash. And so in a way, English cricket has got a lot left behind compared to other countries. So all of the franchise leagues that happen in India and South Africa and Dubai and stuff, they've all accessed all these enormous amounts of cash, and English cricket sort of stayed away from it. They were offered a couple of years ago $450 million for the tournament by Bridgepoint, and that was for the tournament rather than the teams to buy the actual tournament. And they turned it down, I think, believing they could get more, and they have indeed got a valuation of nearly £1 billion.
It's a remarkable amount of money. Now, all Indian Premier League teams have bought the English franchises. We've had Americans as well involved. So it really is becoming a sort of global game being played in England, which I think is going to be interesting. But there's a women's 100 competition as well. Is that going to be a game changer for professional women's cricket in terms of how much they get paid, for example?
What the investors have bought is the men's and women's teams under their banner. It's all The women's 100 has been seen as kind of the biggest success, really, of the whole entire competition, which is, of course, a very divisive competition. Traditional cricket lovers don't love it, but for the women, that's been already a game changer. And so they should see significant pay rises.
What does this mean for county cricket?
In terms of cold hard cash, it's incredible. The 11 counties who don't host a team are in line for £1.5 million windfall from this, and with probably more to come in the future, a little bit more in the future. And bear in mind that for some of the smaller counties, their annual income is only around 7 million, most of which comes from the ECB's TV money. 27 million, it's staggering money. It's more money than they've ever had. They're not allowed to just spend it however they want. They can't, for example, spend it on player wages or bringing in, expensive overseas players. It has to go on infrastructure or paying off debt. There's a lot of debt in the county game, about £180 million worth of debt across the 18 counties. And some of it's at really high interest rates. So some of it will just go on paying off debt. The one thing that it is an issue is it needs not frittering away. There's nothing left to sell now. This is it. There's a one-off windfall. There's nothing left after this. So I think a lot of people are worried that all it is staving off the inevitable, that we will end up with fewer first-class counties, that there won't be a sustainable model, that there isn't going to be meaningful cricket for the teams that aren't involved in the 100. And what happens during August is always the perpetual problem, because, of course, if you're not playing in the 100, you play in the one-day competition, which is basically a sort of second 11 competition that's not on the television and hardly anyone watches. And what it means for players who are not in the 100, the future doesn't look incredible in the long term.
It's interesting what they are buying. It's only a month of cricket every year in August. They don't own any of the venues. And you do wonder, particularly those tech investors who've bought into the London Spirit from Google and Microsoft, whether they might want a piece of Lords over time, because they're not getting the venues that they're playing in.
I'm no expert, but I don't know how these people are ever getting their money back. And maybe they don't care. Maybe it's not a commercial thing for them. And particularly, there were some particularly interesting interviews with one of the tech giants who paid a lot of money for Lords. They are essentially cricket fans who want to just be involved in English cricket. And they paid quite a lot over the odds for the Lords franchise. It was the most valuable. But you do think at some point they're going to want something more than 3 weeks of the summer.
And they can't sell up for at least 5 years, having bought into it now.
I don't think there will be any yield on the investment anytime soon. There's no broadcast deals to be had, really, until 2029. And it is only broadcast money, really, that they're going to see increases in revenue in the tournament. It's interesting about whether this is the thin end of the wedge. Will they want more than 3 weeks? Will the tournament... We've seen the Indian Premier League expand from a month-long tournament to now it's 2.5 months. It's a never-ending expansion. And once they've got their feet under the table and they're at the table and they're controlling the tournament, are they going to put pressure on to want more and more and more and more?
You can only see the 100 getting bigger. There is a business case for investing these large sums of money because the IPL has been so successful in terms of sports rights globally. There's not many that command such big sums. I mean, internationally, there's football, obviously, Formula One, cricket is right up there now as a result of the IPL. And this is, I'm sure they just see this as a growth area, the 100, and I'm sure it will be. So I think there's probably quite a good business case for investing in this, and that the investors will get a return at some point. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised in 10 years' time there's lots of people talking about playing under the 100 undercovers somehow, because as you say, the Great English Summer could be a big challenge.
I'm not as bullish as Ziegs about the business case for this. Certainly, we mentioned it last week, but the valuation of the London Spirit cricket team, the one that is going to be playing at Lords, the home of cricket, is at £300 million with those Indian-American tech investors from Microsoft and Google, etc., deep-pocketed men paying 145 million for 49% of this team. This team that generated just about £2 million in revenue, £29,000 in profit, and with essentially they're buying a brand. They don't own any infrastructure. They don't have permanent players. It's a couple of years old. It's a huge bet. I mean, it might just go to show how rich these guys are, that they've got this fancy play thing and they want to enjoy it. But the idea that there's going to be English cricket teams are going to be as valuable as Premier League football teams, for example, honestly, seems pie in the sky. Now, maybe in 10 years, Ziggs and I will have a conversation again. He'll be proved right. But at the moment, I just can't see a business logic for the valuations such as that.
2020, proposed first in 2001, but then India went and did it better. They managed to create a glitzier, more lucrative competition, really starting this era of franchise cricket. And since then, it seems like England has been trying to play catch up to find its own glamorous new format, and they invented this new one, the 100, which is 100 balls each team does bat. But what it does lead to is yet another format of the game. So if you're an American football fan, you've just had the Super Bowl. It's quite a clear season, the American football season. It's been going as the Super Bowl for almost 60 editions, and English football does look quite similar to how it always has done in the men's game. You've got a top flight, even though it was renamed the Premier League, it's still 90-minute matches, the FA Cup, yes, you had a League Cup. But where we at with cricket, we have the longest version, Test cricket, going since the 19th century up to 5 days. Got one-day internationals, 2020, which is 20 overs per team, and now the 100. Are there just too many formats?
And 10 as well, which is even shorter. It does seem like we might just get to the point where it's about 10 minutes aside. But yeah, there are essentially five formats.
On this pod, I did suggest T1.
Obviously, there's 1 billion people in India. Cricket's a religion. That is their biggest sport, out and out their biggest sport. And so that sort of dictates everything in cricket, really. The real reason that franchise cricket is kind of booming is that actually the value of international cricket is really dropping. And so you can't get the broadcast values from test matches other than big ones, like the Ashes, England, Australia, England, India. When you're playing against smaller test nations, there isn't much money in the broadcast revenue. There isn't much money in one-day internationals. The World Cups and things like that are all sewn up by the ICC centrally. So in order for each individual country to make money from television, they have to have a product that's television friendly. One of the things that has been really popular about the 100 with broadcasters and with TV audiences is that it's short and it's done in 2.5 hours.
And the thing about franchise cricket, it's very different, say, to the global football ecosystem. It's players effectively moving with the summer around the world now. You get drafted into a franchise all around the world, and potentially with some of these investors in the 100, they could be shifting players in a way between India, South Africa, England, and the United States, between various short-form competitions.
And that is the absolutely fascinating bit, that the next bit of development, I think, will be that players become fully contract. At the moment, they're only contracted for the duration of the tournament. So that's 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. But actually, with teams like the Mumbai Indians owning teams in the England, America, India, Dubai, South Africa, the next move is for them to contract players all year round. And so moving much more to the football model where your main employer is your club and not your country. At the moment, everything in English cricket is sort of dominated by the ECB's central contracts, which are the 20 or so England players. And that's what everybody looks to because they're the massive value contracts. But I just don't think it's going to be that way in the future. That actually the big value contracts of millions of pounds will be with your franchise owner, and they are essentially your employer. And your country have to sort of ask permission for you to play for them. I think we'll have a real shift in control over the next few years.
We talked about the future of the football transfer system last week with seeing FIFA expanding in the club game with the Club World Cup, the national team World Cups becoming bigger as well. Is this a potential model, do we reckon, for football? I think FIFA would want this, seeing all the best players just in particular competitions.
Well, you would have thought people in football will be looking at it and wondering how they can do it themselves. I mean, you can say you've got the World Cup, that's every 4 years. FIFA now got the Club World Cup, which I think they're trying to probably replicate that. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised in years to come you see something, Saudi Arabia hosting the football's equivalent of the 100, but not representing national teams necessarily, but franchises. Money talks. The future, maybe.
Interestingly, the England Wales Cricket Board Chief Executive Richard Gould said to me when I mentioned about the prominence of football, I think it's time for us to muscle in on football. And I think that's one of our ambitions. When you look at the share of either broadcast revenue or attendees, we want to increase our market share. So certainly we've got football in our sights.
Yeah, I thought also actually, because I did think about that, because the 100 being played in August, that sort of comes up against football. So I would wonder if there will be pressure to move it so that it doesn't sort of compete for that audience. That's but I'm sure that's something that will happen in the future.
Their model has always been that it should be played in the school holidays, because they were trying to obviously branch out into new audience, particularly families. They want them to be able to come to the stadiums. You don't want young kids out late at night. Matches are played every night of the week. But I suspect it may move to the middle of July we get that nice window sort of every other year when there's not a massive football World Cup. So this year is a big year for cricket. And what's happening this year is that there is no other cricket, international cricket, anything being played during that 100 window. There's no football, there's no Olympics, there's a real kind of window there. But that is just not going to happen every year. And so it's ambitious to go up against football.
Of course, football transfers dominating the summer ever more so as well. So that's another need for the 100 to try to get some of that wider coverage. Here's an interesting other football link I heard raised, that Birmingham's franchise is owned by the owners of Birmingham City, Knight's Head Capital. Of course, featuring a very, very minority investment of Tom Brady. Will Aston Villa fans want to support the franchise now?
Yeah, good question. One thing I wanted to ask you both, because I know you were at the launch, is this issue, because some IPL owners don't refuse to employ Pakistan players. So do you think that is a potential issue, and how will English cricket deal with that?
At the moment, there aren't actually loads and loads of Pakistan players who probably would be counted as marquee, the best players in the world, but that fluctuates. And certainly it's one to keep an eye on.
Very clear answer from the ECB's Richard Gould. We're aware of that happening in other regions, but that won't be happening here.
It's been great to have you on, Lizzie, giving your expert knowledge. And it's, although I look at the 100 and report on the sports business aspects of things, I think there are lots of things I didn't know. So really interesting.
And hopefully a lot of listeners who even aren't fully familiar with cricket have got some great insight too. Lizzie, thanks for joining us here on Sport and Lot.
No problem at all. Great to chat.
And Tariq, you're still out in Kenya.
I'm very fine, as they say here. I've just been to a place called E10, close to Eldoret, one of the towns in the Great Rift Valley. It's known as the home of champions. Perhaps the only place in the world where being a long-distance runner is what most kids dream to do. And the successful ones are as famous as the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi elsewhere. And it's a remarkable place. Thousands of runners all over the place, everywhere, from dawn to dusk, wherever you're looking. It's 2,000 meters above sea level, so that's why a lot of foreign athletes come here as well for training. An incredible place. Hopefully, we will be reading more about this trip in the next few weeks.
That's quite a teaser. Look forward to hearing more, and look forward to hearing from you. Grateful if you hit subscribe, rate and review us on whichever platform that you're listening to us on. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, check that you're still following us, because there's a change potentially to the feed, which might mean you're unfollowed, just to sort out some technical matters. But as ever, thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.